Good morning and welcome. I'm Susan Weller, the director of the University of Nebraska State Museum, and it is my pleasure this morning to host you for our keynote. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Volpe. Dr. Christopher Volpe is the executive director of Science Counts. Chris received his PhD from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. With his academic background in atmospheric chemistry and 2 decades of private sector experience in marketing and branding of science outreach and educational services, Chris is a very strong proponent of using traditional marketing techniques to better understand public attitudes about science and their attitudes about the perceived benefits of science to society. Now, prior to Science Counts, Chris was the president and co-founder of Prismatic Laser Programs, LLC, the nation's leading provider of STEM-based assembly programs to elementary and middle schools. Now, in his free time, and we won't quiz you on this, but a fun fact about Chris is he is an air show demonstration pilot for several types of historically significant World War II era aircraft. We've invited Chris to speak to you this morning about his work with Science Counts. In his role as executive director, he is working to foster stronger public support for science, particularly basic research. So Chris, welcome to SciComm 2020. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for the very gracious and generous introduction. I sound far more interesting than I am. It's an absolute delight to be here at SciComm 2020. My only regret is that we can't do this in person, but I know we all share that regret. But that's okay. We're going to have a great time looking through some data. I was torn when I put up the title of this talk, especially the part that says before there was COVID, because that's a great reason for some people to say, oh, great, I'm going back to sleep because none of this is relevant anymore, right? COVID-19 has changed the world. It will never be the same. And Americans' views about science surely will never be the same. Well, I'm not so sure about that. And certainly if you've been watching the news for the last 2 or 3 months, you see that even though we are very much in the midst of the health consequences of COVID-19, there's this great energy for people to return to normalcy. In fact, by definition, surviving COVID-19 as a society, getting past this to some degree means to be able to start living our lives back the way they were before coronavirus and start thinking the ways we used to think before coronavirus we used to think before that as well. So it's really actually very, very useful to see where Americans were back in the fall. And most of the data I'm going to share is from 2019, because that's going to be the place where a lot of Americans are going to very much want to return and relax back to channel my inner chemist. That's sort of the ground state, and we're in an excited state. And inevitably, society is going to want to return back to the ground state. Will some things be different? Absolutely. And certainly there's going to be social and economic consequences of COVID-19 that we're only in the very early stages of. But it's really helpful to kind of see what's ingrained in Americans' kind of hearts, minds, and souls when it comes to science, to be able to forecast to some degree where things might go in the months ahead. And as science communicators, take the opportunity to connect with science, connect with the public via science as things move along. So I've been doing this. I've been involved with Science Counts since its inception, which is about 5 years ago. And on my first day, in essence, I was handed 3 charts, 3 pieces of data. The first was this time series. And this is from NORC at Chicago, but Pew has very similar data as well, which in essence asks Americans, do you think science is useful? Do you think it's beneficial? And as far back as you can go, Americans have overwhelmingly felt science is good, is beneficial, is a good thing, has positive outcomes. The second piece of data is that if you look at trust in scientists or scientific leaders, it's also been remarkably stable. In this chart, it's the orange line, and you can go back to 1973, I mean, essentially 50 years at this point, and see it hasn't moved. Interestingly, public trust in almost every other institution has decreased, with one exception, and that is the military. And so again, looking at this, this is good news. And just to note, you might look at the axis here, the y-axis, and say, well, 40%, that doesn't seem that good. But this particular data set is a great deal of confidence and trust in leaders. And so when you ask, some or a great deal, you get up to 80 or 90%. So the moral of the story is that as far as we can see, going back, Americans think science is great, and they think scientists are great and they're worth being, they're trustworthy. The dilemma is that a survey was conducted in 2011 and then again in 2015, which posed the questions. This was a national survey, not conducted by Science Counts. This was performed by the Science Coalition and others, which posed the question, if the federal government needed to balance its budget, what federal program should be cut first? And it gave the following choices. And you can see in 2011, scientific research was the top program that Americans felt should be cut. And then again in 2015, scientific research fared poorly as well and was the first choice in terms of things being cut. So the mystery, the dilemma is, how can Americans think science is so great and scientists are so great, but it's the first thing on the chopping block? Now, if you look at this table, there's some interesting things that the folks who did this survey did that I think was very wise. First of all, they broke out scientific research and medical research. You'll see medical research halfway down. And so when it came to medical research, there's strong support to continue to fund that. But clearly, Americans think medical research and scientific research are two different things. And I would argue that to some degree, these are proxies for basic research and applied research. So scientific research would be a little bit of a proxy for basic research, and then medical research in Americans' minds is much more of an applied research, okay? So as we talk about COVID-19, and I would argue, and the jury's out on this yet, there's really no data yet, how this has changed or not changed. But I would say that to the extent COVID has made Americans care more about science, they are compartmentalizing it as a medical issue, which they already feel strongly about. But that's not going to make Americans care about building telescopes or studying phytoplankton or, and other things. They think of them as very different things. So Science Counts said, why is this? How is it that there's strong support for science, but yet it's the first thing on the cutting block? And so we did a national survey in 2015, and we repeated it actually last fall. And we found that there were two reasons. The first reason was that only 1 out of 4 Americans believe that government's role is necessary to drive scientific progress. The prevailing view is that corporations, foundations, and the wealthy, I mean, Elon Musk and Bill Gates, would fill any funding gap if the federal government were forced to pull back. So it's not that we shouldn't be spending money on science. The idea is that the government, if the government had to spend money on other important things, there are other players in the space who would make up the difference. And for those of us who know about the funding, and I won't bore you with the numbers, but that is not the case. The investment, which is almost $100 billion a year at this point, that the federal government puts to basic research in particular, there's no way that the private sector or philanthropy could make up for that. The second driver for this seemingly indifference about investing in science is that less than half of Americans believe that if the US lost its leadership in STEM, it would have any impact on their lives. I mean, think about that for a second, okay? So about only 4 in 10 Americans think that if the US no longer was a leader in STEM research, it would mean anything to their everyday lives. That's really shocking and scary, and it's actually the thing we probably all need to work on. And the foundation for that opinion depends on who you are. And I'm going to talk about liberals and conservatives and moderates a lot, not because this is a political partisan conversation, not at all. It's because when you get into the fine structure of American attitudes about science, one's political ideology is usually the key indicator of where you fall on various issues, followed by one's education level, and then sort of a distant third, fourth, fifth are gender, ethnicity, and whether you're, basically family size and other socio constructs. So in the case of not thinking that a loss of US leadership in STEM would matter to me, for liberals, the reason for that is globalism. It's an aversion to the idea that the US should be leading in science, that it's the idea that science should be something that brings us together as a species. It should bring together the human race. Science should foster international cooperation. And so this idea of sort of competition is not attractive for liberals, especially highly educated liberals. For conservatives, the reason for this is just about relevance. It's about, why should I care? How does it matter to me? How would it affect my life? Okay. So jumping off that last point, the first thing you do, and as Susan said, I'm this unholy hybridization of scientist and marketer. And those two things really actually aren't that different, and that might come shocking, but I won't give you the speech about that. You want to know what people care about, the value proposition, right? Why should they care is the first question. So in our survey in 2015, which we repeated again just 6 months ago, or 7 months ago, we asked some questions, and excuse me here, my computer has decided to do things on its own. We said, how urgent a priority do you think conducting scientific research is for a variety of issues? And on the column on the left are issues that we asked in 2015 and again 4 years later in 2019. And the issues on the right are ones that we asked just in 2019 because we got a little smarter and braver in some of the questions we were willing to ask. And the percentages you see are the aggregate percentage of respondents who said this is of highest priority. So if you like space exploration and you see that 12% down the bottom, I mean, don't completely despair. It just means that only 12% of Americans feel that it should be the highest priority. A majority of Americans do see some value in space exploration, okay? And so you see at the top here, there are things that have to do with personal well-being, curing disease, ensuring safe food and water supplies, et cetera, working its way down. Now, what was interesting was that for the issues on the left, there was virtually no change. In fact, none of them changed in a statistically significant way over 4 years. So these are really grounded in closely, deeply held values and world perspectives. You'll also see the environment and energy problems, 56, 57%. And we had assumed that those were good proxies for climate change. And in fact, that's the case. When we finally did ask a question about climate change in 2019, you'll see on the right, 55%. It's virtually, I mean, it's essentially the same response. And so I want to show you a bit of information about that, a bit of data about that. Now, these aggregate numbers are nice, but unfortunately, we live in a pretty polarized society. So you really do have to get into the weeds and look at specific subgroups of the public to have an accurate idea of what's going on. So I want to look at a couple of issues. So what we did was we took, for example, curing disease, which, as we saw, 76% of Americans overall think that this is among the highest priorities of scientific research. And we broke Americans up into 9 buckets. We separated them based on their political ideology, liberal, moderate, conservative. And then we also further subdivided them based on their education. And so you have these 9 different groups. And if you plot them out, and you probably have never seen a plot quite like this, you have these 9 different polygons. So for the first one, let me just walk you through. You don't have to look too closely. But what you see is we've striated liberal, moderate, conservative vertically. And then for each, there's 3 subgroups. Depending on education, you have squares, triangles, and circles. And here's the hint not to hurt yourself by looking back and forth between the key. The more sides a polygon has, the more education one has. So squares have 4 sides, triangles have 3 sides, and my kids tell me circles have 2 sides, an inside and an outside. So there you go. So just remember, more sides means more education, and you don't have to look at the key. But, and as you go further to the right, we're plotting the percentages that feel that this is an urgent priority. So what you see here is more or less, Americans all agree pretty strongly that curing disease should be a high priority for science. Okay, and it's one of the few issues that shows that. Now you get into things that show some polarization. National defense. Okay, here's an issue that conservatives feel is a much higher priority for science. Liberals much less so. And then you also do see a secondary splitting where depending on the education you have, those who are more educated feel a little less strongly about the role of science in national defense than those with less formal education, okay? And we have dozens of these, and I'm not going to drag you through dozens of these, but I just want to show you the texture, why you really do have to get in the weeds on these issues. Now, one interesting issue was the role of science in assisting the disabled. This is a bit of an anomaly or unique, because here's a case where overall 45% of Americans think that this is of highest priority, but there isn't this partisan divide. One's ideology doesn't really seem to make a difference. Here is a case where your education, your socioeconomic status is what makes a difference. And so again, you can see those who have higher education, formal education, don't feel as strongly about this issue as those with less education. And then I wanted to show you one of the changes over 4 years, and that is the role of science in the environment. Now, overall, as an aggregate, there is no statistical difference between 54 and 56% between 2015 and 2019. But when you get into these 9 segments, there has been a change. And again, you just let your eyes wash over this. And what you see is that, in fact, for liberals, there was a solid 10% jump in support for the role of science in the environment. Moderates are more or less the same. And then it looks like it's sort of on the border of statistical significance, but it looks like conservatives actually may have slid to have a little bit less support. So just an important safety tip. Whenever you look at national polls, especially about contentious issues, and you sort of get the overall ballpark picture of Americans, that's not good enough. We really need to go and look at the segmentation and look at subgroups of Americans to get a truly accurate picture of what's going on, so that polarized views don't simply average out. Okay. So what we learned from this is that, wow, Americans' prioritization of science is closely coupled to the issue at hand. So this must be an important clue in terms of how Americans, internalize and feel about science. And as a marketer, that is brand, okay? Brand is how you feel and think about an object or an idea or a person. So we immediately pivoted to ask ourselves a very simple question. What do people hear when we say science? Okay, because it seemed like we didn't have a good handle of that as a community. So this is a definition I use because there's sort of the capital B brand and the lowercase brand, and we're using the lowercase brand here. So what I mean is, brand is the emotional, sensory, and cognitive reflex experienced when a person first encounters an object, person, or idea. Okay, so to personify this is like a reputation. An example is cactus. If I say cactus, uh, a whole bunch of things pop in people's heads. You're probably seeing the color green. It's probably warm outside. You're probably feeling dry and prickly, right? So that one word cactus sort of came with all of these ideas and these emotions and these sensory feelings. That's what we mean when we say brand. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because brand is the unspoken starting point upon which all additional information is gauged. So if I was going to say, great, let's talk about a cactus. Let's talk about an Antarctic cactus. That probably feels weird because our view of the word Antarctic and our view of the word cactus they're not exactly congruent, and rightfully so. There is no Antarctic cactus. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say it's that initial springboard, that initial jumping off point. All right, so the question is, when we say science, what do people hear? A couple of examples to just drive this home, because this is Sunday morning, and we sort of warmed this up. Harley Davidson, here's a product. A lot of people think Harley Davidson sells motorcycles. They do not. That is not their brand. Harley Davidson's brand is freedom with attitude. Okay, that's why you buy a Harley Davidson. Okay, the loud sound is really important for the attitude part. And you will never see a picture of someone driving a Harley on a crowded, congested road in the rain with bugs in their teeth, because that's not congruent with the image, the brand that Harley Davidson is trying to portray. Just another consumer example, Apple. Okay, this is an old Apple ad from the late 1990s. For those of us who are too young to know who this is Muhammad Ali, very famous and a bit controversial boxer, very outspoken, a very unique brand unto himself. And so they chose Muhammad Ali for this ad because their brand, Apple's brand, is irreverence with style. And that's via Steve Jobs. Apple is not a technology company, it's a fashion company. It certainly was under Steve Jobs. What it is becoming now is a different question, but that is what you bought into if you bought an Apple product 15 or 20 years ago. Knowing your brand and getting it right is really important, because otherwise it can go really wrong really fast. And I just wanted to give one fun example of really messing up your brand, sort of losing touch with how the public sees you. The example of this is New Coke. Again, some of us maybe not all of us are old enough to remember New Coke. This was 1985. Well, in the mid 80s, there was a product war between Coke and Pepsi. And Pepsi was very much sort of tying into the new, young, hip feel, the vibe. They had Michael Jackson as a spokesman and all this other stuff. So Coke, which is a very well-branded company, kind of lost track of how people feel about them. And they thought that their brand also was associated with cool, hip, and trendy. And so to be cool and hip and trendy, you obviously need to change and evolve. And so they came out with this idea, New Coke. And it was an absolute catastrophe. I mean, people were practically, having riots in the street. And the reason was that Coke's brand was not cool, hip, and trendy. It was actually nostalgia. That's what people associated with Coke. And so Coca-Cola learned a very hard, expensive lesson. And ever since then, you'll see Coca-Cola's ads usually go back to sort of, Norman Rockwell looking vintage pictures, certainly around the holidays, because Coca-Cola is about going back home, so to speak. Okay, so for those of us who are doing science communication, it is of the utmost importance for us to know science's brand. What one word or group of words do people viscerally associate with the word science? And so we've done a series of studies to get clues. The first is you asked people what words do they positively and negatively associate with the idea. And so these are the words that people positively associate with science: discovery, curiosity, invention, innovation, optimism, and frankly, a surprise to us completely was youth. Okay, so these are the words that you should be using in your vocabulary if you're doing science outreach or science communication. And then these are the words you should be avoiding at all costs if you can, because these are negatively associated with science. Competition, because again, science should be something that brings us together, doesn't divide us as a people. Investment, budget, funding, money. In other words, these financial terms. And also the past, and this was a surprise. When you talk about, former scientific discoveries, for a lot of Americans, that suddenly becomes a history lesson. It is no more about science. Science is all about forward looking. It's the future, not looking back. Interesting. And that second part came out when we asked people to talk about science. We did this via a whole series of focus groups after the last 4 years. And you hear the same phrases used over and over again. Science is a means to an end. Science is in essence like a tool. Science is a path to better tomorrow. So it's not actually the better tomorrow, it's the way to get there. And then science is something that serves the greater good. It should rise above all these other sort of mundane things that we have to deal with in our lives. And it should be very altruistic. So when you take those words, you take these phrases and a lot of other data that we acquired, you come to the conclusion that the brand of science is hope. Okay, so when we say science, people hear hope. Those are synonyms in the public lexicon, which is why when a scientist talks about science and gives bad news, you're immediately going to divide and alienate a lot of Americans, because that is just not congruent with the way that they like to think about science. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's our job to deliver bad news when we need to deliver bad news. But we should all be very conscious that this is the initial starting point of any conversation. Okay, now that sounds like a nice bumper sticker. Science is hope, and maybe it is. But we wanted to go more deeply and look at the word hope and think about that. So science is hope. Okay, well, what is hope? Well, hope is the expectation of a future outcome, right? When you hope for something, you want something in the future to come to pass. So it in itself is a clue. We would argue it's telling us that when it comes to science, Americans are very much payoff minded, okay? So science, again, is a tool to accomplish something or make something happen or solve a problem. That's a pretty significant finding if it's accurate, because the implication is that the value that Americans put on science intrinsically depends on the value they associate with whatever payoff they're thinking about or we're presenting. And we just saw that with all of those crazy polygon, examples I showed a few minutes ago. You could see how if you change the focus of the scientific research, you can fundamentally change who supports it and who's against it. So this is not about data. And I suspect most people in this, most people listening kind of already know that. We've learned that lesson with climate change communication. It's taken 30 years. That it doesn't matter how much data you hit with people. What really matters at the end of the day is how they feel about the eventual payoff, the issue that science is being applied to. And if they don't think it's an important issue, or if they think it's a bad issue, they're just not going to support the science. And this goes both ways, by the way, politically. It's not just one side of the political spectrum that feels this way. You look at other issues, and it's the other side as well. So it's sort of a broad phenomenon. Okay, so the public associates science with hope. Last year, we said, okay, what about scientists? What do scientists associate science with from a branding point of view? If they could, if you had to sort of distill it into one word. So we partnered with our friends at the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, and we conducted, actually, it was the same survey, but to two different groups of scientists. The first group was a randomly selected group of STEM faculty at AAU universities. That's the Association of American Universities. So it's sort of 63, I don't want to say they're the top research universities, but they tend to be, the R1 universities that belong to AAU. So that was a randomized sampling. And then we also had 30 professional societies in parallel who were willing to distribute the online survey to their membership. And so that's the society data set. And that is not by any means sort of statistically representative, but it's still really useful because we wanted to look at how intrinsic characteristics within an individual are connected. So just to see how various variables sort of, patterns that emerge. And then of course we have our data for the public. And so we asked the question, which word best sums up how you feel about science? And we gave 5 choices and then a fill-in option, an other. And we let scientists fill in the word or the phrase. And not surprisingly, about a third of them they didn't like any of our choices. And they filled in what they thought was the right word, which in most cases were synonyms of what was already there, but that's fine. And so after compiling, this is what we found. When you look at the STEM faculty at AAU universities, 43% used some form of the word joy and excitement. A bit surprising to us, just over a third also used the word hope, and everything else was a distant third. Things like evidence, knowledge, truth, curiosity, discovery, terms that some people thought actually would score much higher, not so much. With regards to the society, sort of the parallel data set, the numbers are largely the same. The margin of error here, the confidence interval, is about plus or minus 3%, by the way, at a 95% level. So again, slightly more joy and excitement, but it's still a significant number of hope, and everything else drops off. And then in a quantitative sense, we asked the public this question more recently, and we found, not surprisingly, 2/3 of Americans associate hope with science, to confirm kind of our conjecture earlier on. Okay, so this is great. Clearly, scientists think about science in many cases in a different way than the public. That's not a surprise. We as scientists are a self-selecting group. That's kind of how it works with any professional class. The professional class looks at what they do differently than the general public. But we wanted to see if there were any patterns that emerged from this. So we, in essence, decided to focus on joy, excitement, and hope because they were by far the most frequent responses. And then plot this out on a phase diagram. And the hypothesis was that these words, joy and hope, are clues to what's going on in people's heads and hearts. So we already said that for people who think hope and science are congruent, you're thinking about this in a reward in the future, and you're payoff minded. For the many scientists who answered joy and excitement, our thought is that if you think about joy and excitement, if you're experiencing joy and excitement, you're experiencing that in the now, in the present tense. So you're clearly doing something that you value. So you're getting your emotional reward in the present. And so the hypothesis is that's a clue that you're process minded. You like what you're doing. You're not necessarily just waiting for the eventual payoff down the road. Okay, so we have these 2 different mindsets potentially, payoff minded and process minded. And we plotted them on a phase diagram. And so what you have is on the y-axis, joy and excitement, on the x-axis, hope. And so these are the subgroups. If the dotted line would be a group that has answered joy and excitement and hope, same percentages. So if you're above that line, we're going to say that your group is more process-minded. If you're below the dotted line, you're more payoff-minded, like the public is clearly much more payoff-minded, okay? And so you can see that overall, the scientists are kind of almost on the line, slightly more process-minded. So we broke AAU and society scientists into subgroups even further. We looked at their political ideology, and there was essentially no difference, okay? We looked at where they were in their career, graduate students versus senior faculty. Again, no difference. It was pretty much where you see the red and the blue data points. We looked at whether scientists were private sector, worked at academia, worked at a government lab. Again, no difference, no rhyme or reason. And then we looked at scientists' field of study, and a pattern emerged. And this is what we got. And let me just very quickly walk you through the labels. Okay, first of all, I think you could figure out, what field of study is associated with what label. And if it has a -A after it, that means it's from the AAU sample. If it doesn't, it means it's from the general 30 society sample. And you could see a pattern. For the most part, our friends in physics and kind of the physical sciences are up and to the left, and then down and to the right. You have engineers. You have social scientists who are in more of this payoff-minded area. The chemists seem to be confused. They're on both sides, but we think that there might be reasons for that. Sort of one sample set had many more chemical engineers participate than the other. So you might see that engineering effect in there. But this is really interesting because this suggests that, first of all, there's a bit of a cultural divide between the public and scientists. And again, I don't think that's a surprise. But the magnitude of that cultural divide might vary in a predictable way depending on what your field of science is. And it's been suggested that what you see also here is a difference between scientists who tend to be more basic research, theoretical investigators, with the physicists, mathematicians, et cetera, versus those that are doing research that's more applied. And then there's also one more data point we just got, and that is medical professionals. And again, not terribly surprising, medical professionals sort of live in a bit of that empty space. They help connect this continuum between the public, which is very payoff-minded, and academic, or I don't want to say academic scientists, but scientists in general, which you see here. Okay, so let me just wrap this up here. So what are some of the main takeaways? A majority of Americans are indifferent to US leadership in STEM research, and that is a real problem. That's not just going to affect funding, that's going to affect sort of the American scientific enterprise sooner or later. The question, of course, is will COVID change that? And I don't have an answer for you yet, but obviously it's something to be monitored closely. Regrettably, I don't think it's going to change overall. CDC and folks who study infectious disease will benefit greatly because suddenly their value has gone way up. But will this mean that you have a better chance building telescopes on mountains or studying phytoplankton? Or not necessarily. And in fact, one can imagine a situation where people actually argue against funding those sorts of scientific activities because there isn't a clear-cut payoff or need that is being addressed. So that's something we have to watch very closely. Take-home point for sure, when we say science, Americans hear hope. The ramifications of hope is an expectation of an eventual payoff. So the manifestation of that is the public feels it's within their rights to pick and choose what science is valid based upon the payoff, not the quality of data. And then in terms of a cultural divide between the scientific community and Americans that we have to bridge, and many of us are working hard. The whole point of SciComm 2020 is to help equip us with knowledge and tools to do this, is that there is this fundamental cultural divide between scientists and the public, and that that may be associated with this fact that science means different things. For scientists, many scientists, it's much more about the process of discovery and inquiry, but for the public, it is clearly much more about what do you get in the end? What's the eventual payoff? And so I'd just like to end with this wonderful quote from Maya Angelou. People will forget what you say, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel. And so as scientists, we live on evidence and data. We should never abandon that, but it is crucial that we acknowledge that our audience is always human beings. And so there's this feeling and emotional connection that we always must make, usually at the very beginning of a conversation, and then ideally at the very end. The data and the thinking should be sandwiched in between, all right? And I just want to acknowledge and thank all of the philanthropies, the professional science societies, a few private sector partners and academic partners who've helped Science Counts do what we do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was amazing. We have a few questions for you, and I think I'm going to riff off the one that starts off to be honest, you made me realize I had a negative lowercase brand to the word branding in the intro text to your talk. When you're talking with scientists, do you often get the reaction? And then where I want to riff on this is you mentioned early on, you said you thought marketers and scientists were actually quite similar, and help us understand our negative bias and how we should open up our minds.
Yeah, and let me say, someone told me 20 years ago when I was finishing my PhD at Scripps, they said, I think you'd be a natural marketer. And I have to tell you, I was deeply offended by that statement. So I get it. The whole point of being a scientist was not to have anything to do with words like marketing or sales or that. I mean, right? Why soil yourself? And so I'll try to give you the shortest answer. For many of us, marketing is synonymous with promotion and advertising. The reality is that is only a very, very thin sliver of what marketing really is. Marketing is a creative process that has 4 steps. Step 1, observe the world and assess need. See what people need or want. That's step 1. Step 2 is come up with the idea of a service or a product to address that need. You create something. Step 3 is you get it out there. You get people to use it. That's the promotion marketing, the advertising part. And then step 4 in principle is, well, see how it worked, evaluate, and then change. You go back to the beginning. So observe, sort of come up with an idea, test it, and then adapt. That sounds a lot like the scientific method. And it is a lot like the scientific method. Now, I'm not saying they're the same. I mean, they're the same in terms of complexion, but obviously what we do as scientists is much more rigorous. But it's the same process. And often we skip that as observe and assess a need question. In science communication, we have an agenda and we want to say what we want to say, and we do it and we lose our audience. And so that's one of the things we all can learn from marketers is we should always assess the need. Listen first before we start talking.
Well, that's an excellent answer. We had a couple of people asking what would be your advice to science communicators about taking our view of science to the public. And so is there anything else you'd like to add to the answer you just gave?
Sure. What I would say is, first of all, separate strategy from tactics, which in English words, what that means is, what are you trying to accomplish versus how are you going to do it? We actually very often kind of fold those two together and it gets really confusing and messy and mixed up. So when you're in front of any audience, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? And make sure that you're going to go about that the right way. That's different than how you're going to do it. So for example, short example, if you want to change someone's mind, you want to persuade them, okay? That is about advocacy. You are going to have to advocate for them to change their mind. That is not education. In other words, giving people facts and figures, okay? Increasing knowledge. And that's one of the most common sort of misappropriations that scientists do is they think, well, I want to change someone's mind, so I have to beat them over the head with facts and figures. So they use education tools to boost literacy. But the point is not to boost literacy. We do that in lecture halls. The point was to change someone's mind, persuade them. So you have to make sure you match the right set of tools with the right outcome. And I have a little happy slide, it's on SciComm's website, and things like that. So some people like that match up various kind of approaches to desired outcomes. It includes journalism, it includes outreach, and I've been told it's sort of useful for people to help sort out some things. It's sort of a taxonomy, so that might be useful.
Yeah. I'm getting a note that we're at time, but could we go a couple more minutes? And I think so, to answer that question that just came to me from our moderator on high. There were several questions about whether the data, the reports you cited, Chris, are available on the SciComm's website or through publication.
They are, and just to make sure, what I will do, I don't want to make more work for your team, Susan, I will turn that into a nice clean PDF and I will send it to you. And you are welcome to also make that available, all those slides available, you know, to attendees of the conference. I'll be happy to do that. But there's even more data. We just looked at the very tip of the iceberg here in this conversation. So I would encourage people to go to the Science Counts website and click research and reports.
Well, and I'm getting a lot of excellent talk. Thank you for inspiring me. Can you think, this will be the one we'll end on. One of the most famous hopes is JFK's "We choose to go to the moon" speech. Do we have other examples of that kind of hope that drives a major initiative in science?
Yeah, we need to find one. We have one right now, and that is, I have a dream that there will be no more pandemic. I mean, this is a, you know, central galvanizing moment. And there's actually a secondary one too. I mean, I say secondary, not that it's not as important, but you know, and that is, you know, this is an opportunity to make some social changes to ensure that we as a society are as open and equitable, and there's opportunity for all Americans as well. And so that's also sort of going on, and we should seize those moments as well. So I would, 6 months ago, I'd have to scratch my head a little bit and say, we've got to dig deeply, but we have opportunities to do that now. We have to ask Americans, though, what they want the future to look like first, because it can't be our vision. It has to be Americans' vision. And then our job is to show how science can help make that come to pass. That's because JFK's speech, not to deflate it, it was a national defense speech, right? I mean, the space program was very much driven as a Cold War product, which began with Sputnik, which absolutely galvanized the country to say we cannot be second rate when it comes to science. And it culminated with, you know, Apollo 11 and the subsequent Apollos. So a lot of great science happened, and it was a great opportunity. But for a lot of people, it was a national defense thing, like it or not. So we have to be relevant to what people care about. And I think there's lots of opportunities to do that.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to end it there. Chris, thank you so much for joining us this morning. There's many other questions. If we corral them and get them to you, would you be willing to answer them, or would you prefer people reach out to you in a different way?
So I'm happy to do that. I also welcome, if you go to the Science Counts website and you do the contact us, it will go right into my mailbox. So if you have any questions, you want to communicate directly with me, you can do that, or you can email me. My email is Volpe, my last name, VOLPE, @sciencecounts.org. So happy to have individual conversations with folks going forward.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid I'm the only person you'll hear clap, but again, there's a whole round of people clapping on the Q&A. So thank you, Chris. You have a great morning.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody's attention this morning. Bye-bye.